Let's start with cancel culture or woke culture. Mal Fletcher is a social commentator and futurist who's the chairman of the think tank 2030 Plus. I asked him what he thinks the government is looking to achieve.
Well, I think the government's trying to advocate for speaking up about Britain, that is highlighting the positive aspects of British history, British culture. I do think, look, it has to be said that government does have a role to play in promoting what's best in any nation. The best leaders across any enterprise, whether it's business or community groups or governments, know how to hold up a mirror reflecting our better selves and reinforcing positive behaviour in the process. And that's true of national political leaders too. But what concerns me is that governments shouldn't need to take punitive measures, or what could be seen as punitive measures, to inspire a healthy perspective where we celebrate the heritage we have without accepting the baggage. For me, that's more of a concern, that they need to do this to protect a balanced view of history.
And so is this just about history, or does this also creep into cancel culture, woke culture, no platforming? Is it sort of free speech in general, do you think that this is aimed at?
Yeah, I suspect it is. I mean, we don't know fully yet what Mr. Williamson is going to be on about, but I would imagine that it is a reaction partly to cancel culture. And look, I have to say, cancel culture and wokeness, as it's often called, very often at its heart is in the right place. Its motive is to reduce friction between people groups and defend minorities. But I think it's in the execution that sometimes it's misguided. Instead of breeding tolerance, I would argue at times that cancel culture actually seems to bring new forms of intolerance because of an unwillingness to engage with ideas beyond its own. And the question is, how can you bring positive change to a culture you unilaterally declared your enemy? I don't know if you remember, Susanne, President Barack Obama said as much in a Q&A with young activists last year. He told them that if all people do is sort of cast stones at others, that's not real activism. It's not producing change, because activism means working to compromise with people who don't agree with me. And in that way, I think cancel culture works against itself. It actually ties the hands of activism.
Because I suppose it almost then makes it too easy to ignore these groups because they've become so inflexible, would be the argument, so unwielding. You know, what you have to think and the way you have to act becomes so narrow that actually it's much easier to just ignore them altogether and write them off as sort of young, they'll learn when they're older, because they're not engaging in debate.
Yeah, I think there's sadly some truth in that. And, I need to say up front, there's no such thing as unqualified freedom of speech. The right to freedom of speech is limited or proscribed by certain norms of behaviour as well as regulations in government. Free speech has to be accompanied by that commitment to act responsibly for the common good. But I think much of today's no platforming and cancel culture is an excuse for pushing political agendas. It's a practice that not only denies freedom of speech to, say, speakers at universities, it also robs the students that would have heard them of the opportunity to debate for themselves the issues at hand, which is a sad loss to us, I think.
And I guess this is what's so difficult to grasp, and it genuinely feels slippery when you try and talk about free speech, because we know that not everything is okay to be said in a public forum. We have laws against hate speech. So, Mal, how do you talk about free speech in a way that makes any sense in 2021?
Well, I think you have to take into account and be very upfront about what I call the hot response culture that's been engendered by social media. It's not only, social media is wonderful. I use it all the time. But one of the weaknesses is, especially in a time of social distancing and lockdowns where we have fewer filters for our self-expression, there's, more physical space between us than there normally is. The spontaneity of things like social media encourages this discourse of overreaction. So people opt first for a hot response to an issue, a hot answer, an emotive answer, rather than a calm, carefully reasoned one. And we don't gain anything. We lose a great deal when we congregate too quickly behind these barricades and shout before we speak and fail to think before we do either. Some neuroscientists actually are warning now that interacting in this hyper-emotional way might be rewiring our brains so that we will perhaps desperately need empathy but be unable to show it to each other. So part of talking about freedom of speech today has to be in the context of the technology that is making free speech a more hot-button issue.
Well, we can look in the last, how long ago was it? It was the 6th of January, the storming of the Capitol building, if you will. I guess that's what it's become known as. And Twitter evicting, essentially, he's now the former President Trump, from its platform. Was that the right thing to do?
My attitude to that is that nobody elected Jack Dorsey from Twitter or Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook or the leaders of Apple and Amazon to be our censors. They're not elected to office and they're not appointed into that role and they're not accountable to us. That would be my concern with the way that whether it's a right-wing or left-wing that's causing a problem, I think I have a concern on that basis. And I think also in this whole area of discourse, politically and just in our culture generally, we have to recognise that respectful persuasions are a lot more effective in promoting an idea than haranguing or vilifying or even censoring others out of the conversation. I mean, courtesy and empathy are central to all persuasion because they allow people to reconsider their own ideas and weigh up new ones without personal attack. I think in the end, the most positively influential ideas are the ones that are presented with reason, conviction, and a certain level of at least compassion or respect.
I think working as a journalist, the thing that I have found so fascinating and why I love my job is my social media feed is calibrated left and right. It's because it has to be. So I find myself changing my mind a lot, and I'm not allowed to say what I think. So as a result, I find it quite difficult when people are so permanently strident in an area of their thinking. I'm 38, but I have a lot of friends who are a good 10 years younger than me, and they are forever on their Insta stories, flinging up some petition to sign, and they don't ever expect any comeback. They don't expect any conversation. They expect that they can just say, this is wrong, sign this petition. And that's not how grown-up conversation works, is it?
No, I agree with you. I know people like that too. No, you're absolutely right. There has to be a back and forth. There has to be an exchange of ideas in a respectful tone. One of the challenges with social media, and it's not just social media, but it's helped this enormously along, this lack of discourse, is that social media is given to confirmation bias and information loops driven by algorithms that tell us what they think we want to know, exposing us to ideas that they think from previous data we want to be exposed to. So we're not having those serendipitous moments where we're hearing from people that are right out of left field, unless you're really looking at hashtags on Twitter, going through and tracing them back to their sources. And by the way, I think there's a real difference between activism and hashtavism. What I call hashtavism is where I go online to Twitter and I just tweet something with a hashtag and I think I've actually done something about it. I haven't done anything. I've just expressed an opinion and put a hashtag in it. And there's, even signing a petition doesn't necessarily change anything.
Absolutely. Yes. we hope it will change something. We feel like we've done something, but often it's an illusion of having done something and nothing is ever likely to change. So what would be... You're a futurist, Mal, which I love that title. I wish I could call myself that. I can't. How do we shatter this? Is there any hope in that, in post-COVID times, and it will end eventually, we'll all want to be physically together and come out of our digital silos, or are we in this for the long haul?
No, I think in the end, look, crowds are fun. We're social beings and we love being together. I think the emotional impact of an event like a pandemic often outlives the technical cause of the event. So if you look at 9/11 in New York City, you'll remember that American Airlines was shut down for months on end after the event, and tall buildings were stopped. They stopped construction on tall buildings in many cities 9 months after the event. So that wasn't directly the work of terrorists. That was the result of an understandable fear response to the work of terrorists. So human emotion will take longer than the technical to change. So we may take a little while to get used to being in proximity with one another, but once we get over that, the vaccines will be rolled out and we start to get over the emotions, I think it'll be back to, well, hopefully not back to normal, as you said before. I think that a new normal would be healthy if we can reflect on how do we have a more healthy discourse in our society that recognises different generational views, different ethnic views, different world views. All of that would help.
That's Mal Fletcher, who's a futurist, commenting on what the government announced yesterday about advocating for free speech in universities.